Have you ever wondered what really happens when artists record alone in the dead of night? What I'm about to tell you today will make you completely rethink leaving any recording equipment on during the witching hours. This is the story of Seungmin, a 22-year-old music producer, who discovered something absolutely terrifying in a recording he thought he made alone. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to every single detail. Because what happened to Seungmin could happen to anyone who dares to record music in the early hours of the morning. It was a Tuesday, 3 in the morning, and Seungmin was in his small home studio in the basement of his house in Seoul. The city outside was fast asleep, wrapped in that eerie silence that only exists between midnight and dawn. Seungmin had spent the last few weeks working on a demo for JYP Entertainment, one of Korea's biggest music companies, and the pressure was mounting like a weight on his chest. The deadline was Friday, and he still hadn't managed to capture the essence he was looking for. You know that feeling when you're chasing that perfect melody that's right on the tip of your tongue but just won't come out? That's exactly what Seungmin was experiencing, but multiplied by the stress of potentially landing his dream job. The studio was his personal sanctuary, a place he had spent 3 years perfecting down to the smallest detail. Walls covered with gray acoustic foam that he had installed panel by panel. A vintage Yamaha mixing board he'd bought used from a retiring sound engineer. Studio monitors that cost 3 months of his part-time job savings, and his favorite condenser, microphone, an Audio-Technica AT2020 that he lovingly called Mikey. The room had that distinctive smell of electronic equipment and cold coffee that every producer knows well, mixed with the faint scent of his grandfather's old incense that seemed to linger no matter how much he aired out the space. Seungmin's grandfather had passed away just 3 weeks earlier, and the grief was still fresh, cutting through him like broken glass every time he thought about the old man's gentle smile and encouraging words. His grandfather had been a traditional Korean musician who played the gaegeum, a beautiful stringed instrument that sounded like angels weeping when played correctly. The basement where Seungmin now had his studio had actually been his grandfather's music room for over 30 years, filled with traditional instruments, handwritten sheet music, and memories of countless hours spent teaching young Seungmin the fundamentals of melody and harmony. On that specific night, Seungmin decided to try a different approach to his creative block. He had been reading on some underground music production forums about something called liminal recording, the practice of capturing audio during the transitional hours when the world shifts between day and night. According to several producers, who swore by this technique, recording during the quietest hours of the night could capture sonic nuances impossible to achieve during the day. The theory was that without the electromagnetic interference from daily human activity, microphones could pick up frequencies and subtleties that were normally masked by the chaos of civilization. What Seungmin didn't know was that some sounds are better left unrecorded, and some frequencies should never be captured. At 2:55 in the morning, Seungmin methodically set up his recording session with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. He opened Pro Tools, his digital audio workstation of choice, adjusted the preamp levels on his interface, and did a comprehensive sound check that included testing for ground loops, electrical interference, and room noise. Everything seemed normal. The level meter showed a healthy green when he spoke. The noise floor was practically silent, and there was no perceptible interference from any electronic devices in the house. His parents were asleep upstairs. The neighborhood was dead quiet, and even the usual traffic from the main road had died down to nothing. He put on his trusted Sony MDR-7-506 headphones, took a deep breath that he hoped would calm his nerves, and hit the record button at exactly 3 a.m. The red light on his interface glowed like a tiny sun in the darkened room, and Seungmin felt that familiar mixture of excitement and terror that comes with beginning a recording session that could make or break your career. The demo he wanted to record was a melancholic ballad about loss and longing that he had written in the days following his grandfather's funeral. The lyrics poured out of him like blood from a wound, each word carefully chosen to capture the complex emotions of grief, love, and the terrible finality of death. He had titled the song Until We Meet Again, and it represented some of the most personal and vulnerable songwriting he had ever attempted. The melody was simple but haunting, built around a chord progression that his grandfather had taught him years earlier, and the vocal delivery required a level of emotional nakedness that made Seungmin feel exposed and raw. But here's where the story gets interesting, and I need you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you, because the details matter more than you might think. During the first 15 minutes of recording, everything seemed perfectly normal. Seungmin sang, with his eyes closed, lost in the melody, pouring his grief through the music like a river finding its way to the sea. His voice echoed softly in the small studio, and he could feel that he was finally capturing the emotional essence he had searched for so desperately. The words flowed from his lips with a sincerity that surprised even him, and he found himself thinking about his grandfather's last days in the hospital, the way the old man's hand felt in his own, and the final conversation they had shared about music being the language of the soul. What Seungmin didn't notice during those crucial first minutes was that the level meter on his software was occasionally jumping into the red zone, indicating audio peaks that shouldn't have been possible given his careful level setting. These spikes occurred randomly, sometimes during quiet passages, sometimes during his loudest vocal moments, but always accompanied by a barely perceptible change in the room's atmosphere that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Comment below if you've ever had strange experiences recording alone during the early morning hours. Because what happened to Seungmin might have happened to you too, without you realizing it, and your experiences could help other musicians understand what they're dealing with. The first take of Until We Meet Again lasted 23 minutes and 47 seconds, including several false starts where Seungmin stopped to adjust his performance or clear his throat. When he finished, he felt emotionally drained, but artistically satisfied. He had captured something real, something that came from the deepest part of his soul, and he could feel his grandfather's presence in the room, like a warm embrace. What he didn't realize was that his grandfather's presence was more literal than he could have imagined. After a brief break to drink some water and stretch his neck, Seungmin decided to record a second take. He wanted to experiment with different emotional approaches to certain phrases, and he had some ideas about vocal layering that might add depth to the final production. The second take began at 3:31 a.m., and from the very first note, something felt different about the room. The air seemed thicker somehow, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, and Seungmin found himself glancing over his shoulder even though he knew he was alone in the house. His parents were heavy sleepers, and the rest of the neighborhood was dead to the world. But as he sang, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was listening. Someone was present in the room with him, breathing when he breathed, feeling every emotion he poured into the microphone. During the bridge of the song, where he sang about his grandfather's final words, "Music never dies, my boy, it just changes form," Seungmin felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard another voice harmonizing with his own. So faint it might have been his imagination, but so perfectly pitched that it enhanced his performance in ways he couldn't explain. The second take was even better than the first, with an emotional depth and technical precision that surprised Seungmin. When he finished recording at 3:58 a.m., he sat in the silence for several minutes, overwhelmed by the intensity of what he had just experienced. The basement felt different now, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle and his heart race. He decided to do one final take, thinking that the third time might be the charm that would give him exactly what he needed for his demo submission. But as he prepared to hit record again, something happened that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The level meter on his software began flickering green and yellow, indicating incoming audio, even though he wasn't making any sound. Seungmin stared at the screen in confusion, wondering if there was some kind of electrical malfunction or if his interface was picking up radio interference. But as he watched, the meter continued its rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, almost like someone breathing directly into a microphone. Tell me in the comments what you would do in this situation. Would you investigate the source of the mysterious audio levels, or would you pack up your equipment and get out of there as fast as possible? Against his better judgment, Seungmin decided to investigate. He opened the software's input monitoring feature, which would allow him to hear whatever was causing the level fluctuations. What he heard made his hands shake and his mouth go dry with terror. There was definitely something there, not quite a voice, not quite music, but something that seemed to exist in the space between sound and silence. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and somehow familiar in a way that made his heart ache with longing and fear in equal measure. The third take began at 4:07 a.m., and from the first word Seungmin knew that this recording would be different from anything he had ever created. As he sang, the mysterious presence in the room seemed to grow stronger, more confident, more involved in the creative process. The background anomalies became more pronounced, developing into what sounded almost like harmonic accompaniment, as if an invisible choir was supporting his performance. But the truly terrifying moment came during the final chorus, when Seungmin reached the emotional climax of the song. As he sang about love transcending death and memories living forever, he heard something that made him stop singing mid-phrase and stare at his microphone in absolute horror. Clear as day, unmistakable, and impossible to rationalize away, he heard his grandfather's voice singing along with him. Not a whisper, not a suggestion of a voice, but his grandfather's actual singing voice. The same voice that had sung him lullabies as a child and taught him traditional Korean folk songs in this very room. The voice was harmonizing perfectly with Seungmin's melody, adding ornamental flourishes and emotional nuances that only a master musician could provide. Seungmin's voice cracked and he stopped singing entirely, but his grandfather's voice continued for several more seconds, finishing the phrase with a vocal run that was unmistakably the old man's signature style. Then, silence returned to the room like a curtain falling on a stage, leaving Seungmin alone with his racing heart and the impossible evidence captured in his recording software. When Seungmin finished his marathon recording session at 4:30 a.m., he was emotionally and physically exhausted. He had managed to capture 3 complete takes of his song, each one more mysterious and beautiful than the last. But he was also terrified, confused, and beginning to question his own sanity. He saved his project files with trembling fingers, powered down his equipment with unsteady hands, and stumbled upstairs to his bedroom like a man fleeing from ghosts. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of his grandfather, sitting in the basement studio, playing his gyeom and smiling with approval at Seungmin's musical progress. In the dreams, the old man looked exactly as he had in life, gentle eyes crinkled with laugh lines, traditional Korean hanbok flowing around his thin frame, and hands that moved across his instrument's strings with the grace of a master craftsman. Share this story with someone who has lost a loved one, because what Seungmin discovered when he reviewed his recordings will give you chills and maybe, just maybe, give you hope. The next morning, Wednesday, arrived gray and overcast, matching Seungmin's emotional state perfectly. He woke up around noon with that familiar post-late-night session grogginess, but also with an underlying anxiety that made his stomach clench and his palms sweat. After forcing himself to eat some breakfast and take a long, hot shower, he finally worked up the courage to return to his basement studio and face whatever he had captured in those early morning hours. The studio looked exactly the same as always, equipment in its proper places, acoustic foam covering the walls, his grandfather's old chair sitting empty in the corner where it had been for the past 3 weeks. But something felt different about this space, as if the very air had been changed by the previous night's activities. There was an expectancy in the room, a sense that something important was waiting to be discovered. With hands that shook slightly from caffeine and nerves, Seungmin booted up his computer and loaded his recording project. The 3 audio files appeared on his screen like evidence of a crime he wasn't sure he had committed. For several minutes he just stared at the waveforms, noting how they looked different from any recordings he had made before. The audio patterns seemed more complex, more layered, with frequency spikes and harmonic content that shouldn't have been possible from a solo vocal performance. Finally, he put on his headphones and clicked play on the first take. What he heard made his blood run cold and his heart race with equal measures of terror and wonder. There was indeed another presence. On the recording, a voice that wove in and out of his own vocals like a ghost dancing with the living. The voice was subtle at first, appearing only during the spaces between his phrases, humming along with the melody in a way that enhanced rather than competed with his performance. But as the song progressed, the mystery voice became bolder, more present, adding harmonies and countermelodies that demonstrated a level of musical sophistication that took Seungmin's breath away. Most incredibly, the voice seemed to know the song's structure and chord progressions intuitively, never missing a change or hitting a wrong note, always supporting and elevating Seungmin's lead vocal. Seungmin isolated the vocal track and used his most advanced audio analysis software to examine every frequency, every harmonic, every tiny detail of what he had captured. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about audio recording, physics, and the nature of reality itself. The mystery voice occupied frequency ranges that human voices shouldn't be able to reach, with harmonic overtones that created a 3-dimensional quality in the recording that was unlike anything in his experience. More disturbing still, spectral analysis revealed that the voice had characteristics identical to recordings he had of his grandfather singing, the same vibrato pattern, the same breathing rhythm, the same subtle vocal quirks that had made his grandfather's voice unique. Let me know in the comments if you think this could be explained by some kind of audio bleeding or electromagnetic interference, or if you believe something truly supernatural was happening in that basement studio. The second recording yielded even more evidence of paranormal activity. The mystery presence was stronger here, more confident, participating more actively in the musical performance. During certain passages, Seungmin could clearly hear what sounded like fingers plucking strings, not guitar strings, but the distinctive sound of a gyeom being played with the traditional plucking technique his grandfather had spent decades perfecting. Using advanced audio filtering, Seungmin was able to isolate these instrumental sounds, and discovered that they formed complete melodic lines that perfectly complemented his vocal performance. The playing style was unmistakably his grandfather's, the same ornamental techniques, the same rhythmic patterns, the same musical phrasing that had characterized the old man's performances for over 50 years. But the third recording was where Seungmin made the discovery that would change his life forever. This final take contained not just harmony vocals and instrumental accompaniment, but what appeared to be actual communication attempts. During the song's bridge, where Seungmin had stopped singing in shock, his grandfather's voice continued for several measures, but the words weren't part of the song's lyrics. Using advanced audio processing techniques, Seungmin was able to clean up and clarify these vocalizations. What he heard was his grandfather speaking directly to him in Korean. "Don't be afraid, my dear grandson. I'm here to help you finish what we started together. Your music carries our family's soul, and I won't let you face this journey alone." The voice was unmistakably his grandfather's, the same gentle tone, the same slight rasp from years of smoking, the same pronunciation patterns that had been as familiar to Seungmin as his own heartbeat. But this recording had been made 3 weeks after his grandfather's funeral, in a room where Seungmin was completely alone. Hit the subscribe button if you want to hear more incredible true stories like this one, because what happened next will challenge everything you believe about life, death, and the power of love to transcend physical boundaries. Unable to concentrate on anything else, Seungmin spent the entire Wednesday diving deeper into his audio analysis. He used every piece of software he could find: spectral analyzers, noise reduction tools, vocal isolation programs, and even some experimental AI-based audio processing algorithms he found on obscure audio engineering forums. The more he analyzed, the more evidence he uncovered of another presence in that room. There were sounds of movement captured by his sensitive microphone, the subtle creak of floorboards under invisible feet, the whisper of fabric rustling as if someone was adjusting their position in a chair, and even what sounded like pages being turned, as if someone was reading from sheet music during the performance. Most remarkably, there were several instances where the room's natural reverb patterns changed mid-recording, as if the acoustic properties of the space were being altered by the presence of another body. Seungmin's technical analysis revealed layers of audio complexity that shouldn't have been possible from his simple recording setup. The harmonic content of his own voice had been enhanced in ways that suggested the presence of additional vocal cords resonating in the same space. The timing of the mystery vocals was too perfect to be coincidental. They anticipated chord changes, prepared for key modulations, and provided emotional support exactly when Seungmin's performance needed it most. By Thursday morning, Seungmin was a complete wreck. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, had survived on nothing but coffee and anxiety, and was beginning to question not just his sanity but his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but accepting it would mean acknowledging that his dead grandfather was somehow still present and actively participating in his life. Desperate for some external validation of his experience, Seungmin decided to call his older sister Mingi, who lived across town and worked as a music teacher at a local elementary school. Mingi had always been the practical one in the family, skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. If anyone could help him make sense of what was happening, it would be her. When Mingi answered the phone, Seungmin could hear the concern in her voice immediately. "You sound terrible," she said without preamble. "When's the last time you slept or ate a real meal?" Seungmin tried to explain what he had discovered in his recordings, but the words sounded insane even to his own ears. How do you tell someone that you've been making music with a dead person? How do you describe audio evidence of the impossible without sounding like you've completely lost your mind? But as he spoke, Mingi listened with growing amazement rather than skepticism. When he finished his account, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone before she spoke again. And what she said made Seungmin's world tilt on its axis. "Seungmin," she said quietly, "I've been having dreams about grandfather every single night since you started working on that demo. In the dreams, he's always in the basement, sitting in his old chair, playing his gyeojeum while someone sings. He looks so happy and peaceful, more alive than he seemed during his final months when the cancer was eating him up from inside." This revelation hit Seungmin like a lightning bolt to the chest. His sister had no way of knowing about his late-night recording sessions. He hadn't told anyone about his change in schedule or his decision to work during the early morning hours. She certainly couldn't have known about the specific emotional content of his demo or the fact that he had been singing in the exact location where their grandfather used to practice his traditional music. Tell me in the comments what you would do in this situation. Would you try to make contact with the spirit, or would you be too terrified to continue? Mingi continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality as she recalled her nocturnal visions. "In the dreams, grandfather always looks directly at me and says the same thing. Tell my grandson that his music is carrying our family's legacy forward. Tell him I'm proud of his work and that I want to help him succeed. I thought it was just my subconscious processing grief. But now you think he's actually trying to communicate through your dreams." Seungmin finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think our grandfather's spirit is still here, still connected to our family. And somehow he's found a way to be part of your music," Mingi said. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That evening, Seungmin made a decision that would either prove his sanity or confirm his complete break from reality. He decided to go back into the studio and attempt direct communication with whatever presence was sharing his creative space. If his grandfather's spirit was really there, really trying to help him, then maybe they could find a way to work together consciously rather than stumbling through accidental encounters. He spent hours preparing for what he thought of as the conversation. He researched everything he could find about electronic voice phenomena, spirit communication through recording equipment, and the historical precedents for posthumous musical collaboration. What he discovered was that his experience, while unusual, was not entirely unique. There were documented cases of recording engineers capturing unexplained voices, musicians reporting spiritual assistance during creative sessions, and audio equipment seeming to facilitate communication with deceased individuals. More importantly, he found several accounts from other Korean families describing similar experiences with ancestors who had been musicians in life. Traditional Korean spirituality, he learned, held that musicians who died with unfinished business or unfulfilled artistic goals might remain connected to the physical world through their instruments and creative spaces. At exactly 3 a.m. on Friday morning, Seungmin entered his basement studio with a mixture of determination and terror coursing through his veins. This time, however, he set up his equipment differently. Instead of just his usual vocal microphone, he placed recording devices throughout the room, one near his grandfather's old chair, another next to the gyeojim in the corner, and a third positioned where his grandfather used to keep his sheet music. He also set up a video camera to record the entire session, hoping to capture any visual evidence of paranormal activity. The camera was equipped with infrared capability, allowing it to record in complete darkness and potentially reveal things invisible to the naked eye. Before he started recording, Seungmin spoke aloud to the seemingly empty room, his voice shaking with emotion and fear. "Grandfather, if you're really here, if you're really trying to help me with my music, please give me a clear sign. I miss you so much it feels like a physical pain in my chest. I want to honor your memory and carry on our family's musical traditions, but I need to understand what's happening. Please, help me understand." Like this video if you believe that love can transcend death, because what happened next will give you goosebumps and restore your faith in the eternal nature of family bonds. For several long minutes, the room remained completely silent. Seungmin began to wonder if his emotional state and sleep deprivation had caused him to imagine the entire experience. Maybe the audio anomalies could be explained by equipment malfunction or electromagnetic interference. Maybe his grief had made him hear things that weren't really there. But then, slowly and unmistakably, the microphone positioned near his grandfather's chair began to register activity. The level meter flickered from black to green to yellow and back again in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The pattern repeated several times before settling into a steady, gentle pulsing that resembled a heartbeat. Seungmin's own heart began racing as he realized he was witnessing something truly extraordinary. He activated the audio monitoring for that specific microphone and heard something that made tears stream down his face. The sound of someone settling into the old wooden chair. The familiar creak of springs and joints that had supported his grandfather's weight for decades. The soft sigh of someone making themselves comfortable for a long creative session. "Grandfather," Seungmin whispered into the darkness. The response came not as a voice, but as a series of gentle sounds, fingers drumming against wood in a pattern. Seungmin recognized as his grandfather's old nervous habit when he was thinking about music. The soft rustle of pages being turned. And then, most remarkably, the delicate sound of gyeojim strings being plucked in a simple but beautiful melody. Seungmin began to sing his demo again, but this time he approached it as a duet rather than a solo performance. He left deliberate spaces in the melody where his grandfather might want to contribute, and he sang certain phrases as questions that invited harmonic responses. The result was the most beautiful and emotionally complex musical performance of his life. His grandfather's presence was no longer subtle or hidden. It was full, confident, and actively collaborative. The old man's voice joined Seungmin's in harmonies that were so perfectly crafted they seemed to have been rehearsed for years. The gyeojim accompaniment was intricate and supportive, adding layers of traditional Korean musical elements that transformed Seungmin's modern composition into something that bridged centuries of cultural heritage. But the most incredible moment came when Seungmin reached the song's emotional climax and found himself overwhelmed by the weight of his own grief. His voice cracked and faltered, and for a moment he thought he would have to stop the recording. That's when his grandfather's voice became dominant, taking over the lead vocal with a strength and clarity that defied death itself, singing the words that Seungmin couldn't manage. "Until we meet again, your love lives on in every note, in every breath, in every beat of my heart that remembers yours." When the song ended, the silence that followed was different from any silence Seungmin had ever experienced. It was pregnant with meaning, charged with love, and somehow peaceful in a way that made him feel less alone than he had since his grandfather's death. Then, clear as day and impossible to dismiss, came the sound of someone clapping slowly and appreciatively, the exact rhythm and cadence of his grandfather's applause after Seungmin's childhood performances. When the old man would beam with pride and say, "Beautiful work, my boy, beautiful work." Comment below if you've ever felt the presence of a loved one who has passed away, because these connections are more real and more common than most people realize. When Seungmin reviewed the video footage the next morning, his hands trembled as he watched the playback frame by frame, while the main camera showed him singing alone. In the studio, there were several anomalies that defied explanation. During the passages where he heard his grandfather's voice most clearly, the lighting in the room shifted subtly, creating shadows that moved independently of any light source. Most remarkably, during the final applause, the empty chair creaked and rocked slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it to give a standing ovation. But the audio analysis revealed the most stunning evidence yet. Using the multiple microphones he had placed around the room, Seungmin was able to create a three-dimensional audio map of the recording session. The data showed that his grandfather's voice and instrumental contributions were coming from specific locations in the room: the chair where the old man used to sit, the corner where his gaijum was kept, and the spot where he used to stand when he wanted to project his voice for teaching purposes. The demo that Seungmin submitted to JYP Entertainment that Friday afternoon was unlike anything he had ever created or anything the company executives had ever heard. The emotional depth was extraordinary, the harmonic complexity was masterful, and the production quality was so rich and nuanced that it seemed to have been created by a full orchestra rather than a single vocalist with minimal instrumentation. The company's A&R director called Seungmin personally within hours of receiving the demo. "I don't know how you created this," the executive said, his voice filled with amazement. "But it's the most beautiful and emotionally powerful piece of music I've heard in 20 years in this business. We want to sign you immediately, and we want you to produce an entire album with whatever technique you used for this recording." But Seungmin knew the truth. He hadn't created this masterpiece alone. He had been guided, supported, and collaboratively inspired by a love that was stronger than death itself. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what happened over the following months will restore your faith in the eternal nature of family bonds and the power of music to connect souls across the veil between life and death. Over the weeks that followed his supernatural recording session, Seungmin's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. His grandfather's presence in the studio became a regular, almost mundane part of his creative process. The old man seemed to have an infinite well of musical wisdom to share, guiding Seungmin toward artistic choices he never would have made on his own and helping him develop a unique sound that blended traditional Korean musical elements with contemporary pop sensibilities. The collaboration wasn't limited to just music creation. His grandfather seemed to be actively mentoring Seungmin in the business aspects of his career as well. During recording sessions, Seungmin would often receive sudden insights about song structure, lyrical content, or production techniques that seemed to come from outside his own knowledge and experience. These inspirations invariably led to improvements in his work that impressed even seasoned industry professionals. Word began to spread throughout Seoul's competitive music industry about the young producer who was creating impossibly beautiful and emotionally resonant tracks. Other artists started requesting to work with him, and his small basement studio became one of the most sought-after recording destinations in the city. But Seungmin was careful about who he allowed into his sacred, creative space. He instinctively understood that his grandfather's spirit was protective of their artistic sanctuary and wouldn't appreciate just anyone intruding on their musical conversations. The first outside artist to record in Seungmin's studio was a young singer named Hannah, who had been struggling with a deeply personal song about losing her mother to cancer. When Seungmin heard her demo, he immediately felt that this was exactly the kind of project his grandfather would want to support. Music born from genuine emotion and created with the intention of healing rather than just commercial success. The recording session with Hannah began like any normal professional collaboration, but as they worked through the song together, something extraordinary began to happen. The familiar whispers and background harmonies that Seungmin had come to expect from his grandfather's presence began to emerge, but this time they seemed to be directed toward Hannah rather than supporting Seungmin's performance. During the song's most emotional passage, where Hannah sang about her mother's final days, her voice began to take on a quality that surprised both of them. There was a richness and depth to her performance that went beyond her considerable natural talent, as if she was being coached by an invisible vocal teacher who understood exactly how to help her access her deepest emotions. When they listened to the playback, Hannah burst into tears. "I can feel my mother in this recording," she whispered through her sobs. "It's like she was here in the room with us, helping me sing her story." That's when Seungmin realized that his grandfather's spirit wasn't just helping him personally. It was helping any artist who came to the studio with genuine emotion and sincere artistic intentions. The basement had somehow become a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, facilitated by the universal language of music and guided by his grandfather's generous spirit. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about music, death, and the invisible threads that connect us all. As the months passed, Seungmin's reputation grew exponentially, and so did his understanding of his grandfather's continued presence and purpose. He learned through trial and error that the spirit was strongest during the early morning hours, particularly between 3 and 4 a.m., when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. He discovered that certain types of emotional content, songs about loss, love, family, memory, and healing seemed to amplify the paranormal activity and create the most powerful collaborative experiences. Most importantly, he realized that his grandfather's spirit was not trapped or suffering in some kind of purgatory, but was actively choosing to remain connected to the physical world in order to preserve and pass on the musical traditions. He had devoted his life to mastering. The old man had found a way to continue his life's work beyond the limitations of physical death, using his grandson as a conduit to touch the lives of other musicians and music lovers. The collaboration between Seungmin and his grandfather became so natural and fluid that they began to have actual conversations during recording sessions. Seungmin would ask for advice about chord progressions, melody lines, vocal arrangements, and emotional phrasing, and the responses would come through various means, sometimes through the familiar whispers in the recordings, sometimes through the movement of objects in the room, and sometimes through sudden bursts of inspiration that felt like they were being downloaded directly into his consciousness. One particularly memorable night, while working on a complex arrangement that was giving him trouble, Seungmin spoke directly to the room. "Grandfather, I'm stuck on this bridge section. The melody wants to go somewhere, but I can't figure out. Where can you help me?" The response was immediate and unmistakable. The gyeogyum in the corner of the room began to emit soft melodic tones, despite no one touching it. The invisible fingers that plucked its strings played a hauntingly beautiful melody that was the perfect solution to Seungmin's creative problem. He quickly recorded the ghostly performance and used it as the foundation for the arrangement that would eventually become one of his most celebrated compositions. Another night, while struggling with the emotional authenticity of a particular vocal performance, Seungmin asked his grandfather directly, "How do I sing about pain I've never experienced? How do I make someone else's story sound real and honest?" The answer came not through music but through a series of vivid, mental images that flooded Seungmin's consciousness, memories that weren't his own, experiences from his grandfather's life during the Korean War, the pain of losing friends in battle, the joy of returning home to family, the bittersweet nature of survival when others didn't make it. These borrowed memories gave Seungmin access to emotional depths he had never reached before, allowing him to sing other people's stories with genuine empathy and understanding. Let me know in the comments if you believe that memories and experiences can be passed down through spiritual connections, because what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about consciousness and identity. The breakthrough moment in Seungmin's understanding of his grandfather's presence came during a recording session in late autumn, almost 6 months after his initial supernatural encounter. He had been commissioned to create a soundtrack for a documentary about Korean War veterans, and he was struggling to capture the right emotional tone for a particularly difficult segment about soldiers who never returned home. As he worked late into the night, the familiar whispers became more agitated and urgent than he had ever experienced before. His grandfather seemed to be trying to communicate something vitally important, but the message wasn't coming through with its usual clarity. The audio levels were fluctuating wildly, objects in the room were shifting and creaking, and there was an electric tension in the air that made Seungmin's skin crawl with anticipation and fear. Finally, in desperation and frustration, Seungmin stopped his work and addressed the room directly. "Grandfather, I can tell you're trying to tell me something crucial, but I can't understand what it is. Please, I need you to find a way to make this clear. Show me what you need me to know." What happened next was the most profound and terrifying paranormal experience of Seungmin's life. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that his breath became visible in the air, and every piece of electronic equipment began to flicker and hum with an energy that seemed to come from another dimension. The computer screen went completely black for several long seconds, and when it flickered back to life, it displayed a single audio file that Seungmin had never seen before, with a file name that made his heart stop. "For my grandson, final message." The file was dated the day before his grandfather's death, but Seungmin knew for certain that his grandfather had been in the hospital that day. Too weak to speak above a whisper, let alone make a recording. With hands that shook uncontrollably, Seungmin clicked on the mysterious file and prepared himself for whatever revelation awaited him. What he heard was his grandfather's voice, but not as he had sounded in his final days when cancer had ravaged his body and stolen his strength. This was his grandfather's voice from decades earlier, strong and clear and filled with the passion that had driven his lifelong devotion to music. The recording quality was impossibly crisp, as if it had been made with modern equipment, but the content was clearly from another era. "My dear grandson," the voice began, and Seungmin felt tears streaming down his face before the second word was spoken. "If you are hearing this, then it means I have found a way to reach across the veil between life and death to share with you the most important gift our family possesses. What I am about to give you has been passed down through 7 generations of our lineage, and now it falls to you to preserve it for future generations." The recording continued for over an hour, and what Seungmin heard revolutionized his understanding of his family's history and his own purpose in the world. His grandfather began to sing traditional Korean folk songs that had never been written down, melodies that had been passed from father to son in an unbroken chain, stretching back over to centuries. These weren't just songs, they were musical repositories of family history, cultural memory, and spiritual wisdom that would have been lost forever when his grandfather died. But that wasn't the most incredible part of the discovery. As his grandfather's historical voice sang these ancient melodies, Seungmin's modern recording equipment began to capture additional layers of sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the studio. Other voices joined in: his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, and ancestors stretching back through generations, all contributing their own parts to a massive, multi-generational chorus that filled the room with the sound of centuries. The result was a musical tapestry so complex and beautiful that it transcended anything Seungmin had ever conceived possible. It was as if his entire family tree had come alive to perform a concert that existed outside of time and space, with each voice adding its own unique contribution to a collective artistic expression that represented the very soul of their lineage. Turn on notifications for this channel, because what Seungmin did with this incredible discovery will inspire you and show you the true power of music to preserve culture and connect souls across generations. As the supernatural recording session continued, Seungmin realized that he was experiencing something that went far beyond personal grief or individual artistic inspiration. He was witnessing the preservation of cultural heritage that existed nowhere else in the world. Musical traditions that had survived wars, invasions, political upheavals, and social changes that had destroyed so many other aspects of traditional Korean culture. His grandfather's voice explained the significance of each song, the historical context in which it was created, and the specific family members who had contributed to its development over the generations. Some melodies had been created to commemorate births and marriages, others to mourn deaths and departures, and still others to celebrate festivals and seasonal changes that marked the rhythm of agricultural life in Old Korea. But the most powerful songs were those that had been created during times of national crisis, melodies that carried the hopes and fears of people who had lived through Japanese occupation, civil war, and the painful division of their country. These songs were repositories of collective trauma and resilience, musical DNA that contained the emotional experiences of entire generations. As his grandfather's voice shared these precious melodies, Seungmin began to understand his true purpose as a musician. He wasn't just supposed to create modern pop songs for commercial success. He was meant to be a bridge between the old world and the new, a guardian of cultural memory who could translate ancient wisdom into contemporary forms that would speak to modern audiences. Your generation is the last that will have direct access to these traditions, his grandfather's voice explained during a brief pause in the musical revelations. The knowledge dies with me unless you take responsibility for carrying it forward. But you cannot simply preserve these songs like museum pieces. You must make them live again. Make them relevant to the world you inhabit. Make them speak to the hearts of people who have never heard their own cultural heritage expressed in musical form. The recording session lasted until dawn, ending only when the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the basement windows. As the natural light grew stronger, the supernatural presence in the room gradually faded, leaving Seungmin alone with hours of the most precious and irreplaceable musical material he had ever encountered. When he finally reviewed everything he had captured, Seungmin realized that he had been entrusted with a responsibility that was both thrilling and terrifying. He possessed musical knowledge that existed nowhere else in the world, melodies that were the sole surviving examples of centuries-old cultural traditions, and the spiritual mandate to ensure that this heritage would survive for future generations. Hit the like button if you believe that some things are too important to let die, because what Seungmin did next changed not just his own life but the lives of countless other people who were hungry for connection to their cultural roots. Over the following weeks, Seungmin began the monumental task of cataloging and preserving the musical heritage his grandfather had shared with him. Using advanced audio analysis software, he was able to separate the individual voices from the supernatural chorus, creating isolated tracks for each ancestral contributor. He then began the painstaking process of transcribing the melodies into modern musical notation, creating the first written record of songs that had existed only in oral tradition for centuries. But preservation was only the first step in Seungmin's mission. True to his grandfather's instructions, he began experimenting with ways to make these ancient melodies relevant to contemporary audiences. He created modern arrangements that preserved the essential character of the traditional songs, while making them accessible to listeners who had been raised on K-pop and international music. The results were extraordinary. By blending traditional Korean instruments with modern production techniques, incorporating ancestral melodies into contemporary song structures, and using the emotional power of the original stories to drive his lyrical content, Seungmin created an entirely new genre of music that spoke to both the heart and the heritage of Korean listeners. His first album, titled Songs of Seven Generations, became a cultural phenomenon that transcended the boundaries between traditional and popular music. the lead single, built around one of the most ancient melodies his grandfather had shared, climbed to the top of the Korean charts and stayed there for weeks. More importantly, it sparked a nationwide conversation about cultural preservation and the importance of maintaining connections to ancestral wisdom in an increasingly global world. But the impact of Seungmin's work extended far beyond commercial success. Ethnomusicologists from universities around the world began contacting him, eager to study the musical traditions he had preserved. Cultural organizations invited him to perform at festivals and ceremonies, recognizing him as a vital link to Korea's musical past. Most significantly, elderly Koreans who heard his music began coming forward with their own family songs and stories, realizing that they too might be guardians of cultural treasures that deserved preservation. The basement studio where it all began became a pilgrimage site for musicians and cultural preservationists from around the globe. Seungmin opened his doors to researchers, traditional musicians, and young artists who wanted to learn about the techniques he used to bridge the gap between ancient and modern musical forms. The space that had once been just his grandfather's practice room became a living laboratory for cultural preservation and artistic innovation. Comment below if you have family stories or traditions that you think should be preserved, because what happened next shows how individual actions can create waves of change that touch thousands of lives. As Seungmin's fame grew, so did his understanding of his grandfather's continued spiritual presence. The old man no longer needed to communicate through mysterious whispers or supernatural phenomena. His influence had become integrated into Seungmin's creative process so thoroughly that they worked together as naturally as breathing. The basement studio remained a place of powerful spiritual energy, but now it was also a place of purposeful cultural work that honored both the past and the future. Other artists began to report their own spiritual experiences while recording in some studio. Singers would describe feeling the presence of their own deceased relatives during emotionally charged performances. Musicians would find themselves playing traditional instruments they had never studied, and composers would receive inspiration for melodies that seemed to come from ancestral memories they didn't know they possessed. The phenomenon became so consistent that Seungmin began to understand that his grandfather's spirit had somehow transformed the physical space into a kind of portal where the living could access the wisdom and creativity of the dead. The studio had become a place where the boundaries between past and present, individual and collective, personal and universal, became permeable and transformative. One of the most remarkable collaborations occurred when an elderly traditional musician named Master Kim came to the studio to record what he knew would be his final album. Master Kim was one of the last living practitioners of a particular style of Korean court music that was in danger of dying with him. He had spent decades trying to find young musicians who could learn his techniques, but the complexity and subtlety of the tradition made it nearly impossible to transmit through conventional teaching methods. During the recording session, something extraordinary happened. As Master Kim played his ancient melodies, the spiritual presence in the studio seemed to resonate with recognition and joy. The recording equipment captured not just Master Kim's performance, but also what sounded like a full ensemble of historical court musicians, each playing their traditional parts with precision and artistry that had been lost for generations. When they listened to the playback, both Master Kim and Seungmin wept at the beauty and completeness of what they had captured. The recording contained musical knowledge that Master Kim had never learned, techniques that had been lost for over a century, and harmonic complexities that represented the highest achievement of Korean traditional music. "This is not just my music," Master Kim whispered through his tears. "This is the music of my ancestors, my teachers, and all the masters who came before me. They have returned to help me pass on what they spent their lives perfecting." Share this video with someone who loves music, because what I'm about to tell you will give you a new understanding of why music has always been considered the universal language that connects all souls. The collaboration between Seungmin and Master Kim resulted in an album that became a treasure of Korean cultural heritage. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the spiritual phenomena in the studio could be used to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge that might otherwise be lost forever. The space had become a kind of time machine where the wisdom of the past could be made available to the present and future. Word of these miraculous recordings spread throughout the international music community, attracting attention from cultural preservationists, spiritual researchers, and musicians from around the world. Seungmin began receiving requests from artists of many different cultural backgrounds who wanted to explore whether the same techniques might work for preserving their own ancestral musical traditions. A Native American flutist came to the studio, hoping to connect with the spirits of his ancestors, and captured recordings that contained traditional songs his tribe thought had been lost forever. An Irish fiddler discovered that the supernatural presence in the room could somehow access melodies from centuries of Celtic tradition, creating recordings that preserved tunes that had never been written down. A Jewish cantor found that his own ancestral voices joined him in singing prayers and songs that had been passed down through generations of his family. Each of these collaborations added new layers to Seungmin's understanding of what was happening in his studio. The spiritual phenomenon wasn't limited to Korean culture or even to his own family's heritage. It seemed to be a universal principle that could facilitate connections between the living and the dead. Whenever music was used as the bridge between worlds, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell if you want to hear more incredible stories about the mysterious connections between music, memory, and the eternal nature of human creativity. As the first anniversary of his grandfather's death approached, Seungmin felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. The year had been the most successful and meaningful of his life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather's spiritual presence was preparing for some kind of transition. The daily interactions had become less frequent, the supernatural phenomena less dramatic, and the sense of immediate presence less intense. On the exact anniversary of his grandfather's passing, Seungmin decided to spend the entire night in the studio. Not recording, but simply being present and available for whatever his grandfather might want to communicate. He lit candles throughout the room, placed fresh flowers on the old man's chair, and played recordings of some of his grandfather's favorite traditional Korean songs. As the clock approached 3 a.m., the time when their collaboration had first begun, the studio began to fill with the most beautiful, ethereal music Seungmin had ever experienced. But this wasn't coming from his speakers or his instruments, it was coming from the air itself. As if the very molecules in the room were vibrating in harmony to create sounds that existed at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. The melody was simultaneously ancient and timeless, incorporating elements of every cultural tradition that had been explored in the studio over the past year. It was Korean and Native American and Celtic and Jewish and African and European, all at once, a musical expression of the universal human experience that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to the deepest parts of the soul. As the supernatural symphony played, Seungmin began to see translucent figures moving around the studio, not just his grandfather, but representatives of every cultural tradition that had found expression in this sacred space. They were all contributing to the music, each adding their own instruments and voices to create a composition that represented the collective musical heritage of humanity itself. The performance lasted exactly 1 hour, from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m., and when it ended, Seungmin felt a profound sense of completion and peace. He understood, without being told, that this was his grandfather's farewell gift, a musical summary of everything they had accomplished together and a promise that the work would continue even after the direct spiritual connection had ended. But the most incredible part was yet to come. When Seungmin checked his recording equipment the next morning, he discovered that the entire supernatural concert had been captured in perfect digital quality. Every instrument, every voice, every harmonic nuance had been preserved in a recording that represented the most comprehensive musical documentation of human cultural diversity ever created. The recording became the foundation for Seungmin's next project, a global initiative to use music as a tool for cultural preservation and cross-cultural understanding. He partnered with UNESCO, the Smithsonian Institution, and universities around the world to create a digital archive of traditional music that could be accessed by researchers, musicians, and cultural enthusiasts everywhere. But more than just preservation, the project became a platform for living cultural exchange. Musicians from different traditions began collaborating on new compositions that blended their ancestral knowledge with contemporary artistic expression, creating a new form of world music that honored the past while speaking to the present. Tell me in the comments if you think this story is based on real events or if it's a work of fiction. Because the truth about the power of music to connect souls across time and death might be more real than you imagine. The success of some cultural preservation project attracted attention from the highest levels of government and academia. He was invited to speak at international conferences about the role of music in maintaining cultural identity, the importance of preserving traditional knowledge, and the potential for spiritual practices to contribute to artistic and scholarly endeavors. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his own community. Elderly Koreans who had lived through the dramatic changes of the 20th century began to see Seungmin as a bridge between the world they had known and the world their grandchildren were creating. They brought him their own family songs, their own stories, their own musical treasures that they had thought would die with them. The basement studio became a gathering place for cultural memory, where the older generation could share their knowledge with young people who were hungry for connection to their roots. Seungmin facilitated recording sessions where grandparents and grandchildren could collaborate on preserving family songs, creating new arrangements of traditional melodies, and ensuring that cultural knowledge would survive the transition from one generation to the next. The spiritual presence that had initiated this entire journey remained in the studio, but it had evolved from a personal connection between grandfather and grandson into something more universal and accessible. The space had become a kind of cultural sanctuary where the boundaries between past and present, individual and collective, tradition and innovation, could be explored and transcended through the universal language of music. 5 years after that first supernatural recording session, Seungmin's work had touched the lives of thousands of people around the world. Musicians had discovered their own cultural heritage, families had preserved their ancestral knowledge, and communities had found new ways to honor their traditions while adapting to contemporary life. The basement studio had become legendary in music circles, known as a place where impossible things happened and where the deepest truths about human creativity could be accessed through spiritual connection and artistic dedication. Documentary, filmmakers, journalists, and researchers had all tried to capture the essence of what made the space so special, but they invariably concluded that the real magic couldn't be recorded or measured. It could only be experienced by those who came to the studio with open hearts and genuine artistic intentions. But for Seungmin, the most important measure of success was not fame or recognition or even the preservation of cultural heritage. It was the knowledge that he had honored his grandfather's memory and fulfilled the promise he had made to carry forward the musical traditions of his family. Every song he created, every artist he helped, every cultural treasure he preserved, was a testament to the power of love to transcend death and the ability of music to connect souls across any distance or barrier. Hit the subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the message of Seungmin's journey is one that could change your life. Love never dies, music never dies, and the bonds between family members can survive anything if they are built on genuine care and mutual respect. The legacy of Seungmin's supernatural collaboration continues to grow and evolve. The digital archive he created has become one of the most important repositories of traditional music in the world, used by researchers, musicians, and cultural preservationists on every continent. The studio itself has been designated as a cultural heritage site by the Korean government, ensuring that future generations will have access to this sacred space, where the impossible became possible through the power of music and love. But perhaps the most important legacy is the example Seungmin set for how we can honor our ancestors while still living fully in the present. He showed that tradition and innovation don't have to be opposing forces, they can work together to create something more beautiful and meaningful than either could achieve alone. He demonstrated that grief can be transformed into artistic inspiration, that loss can become a gateway to deeper understanding, and that the people we love never truly leave us as long as we find ways to keep their influence alive in our daily lives. Today, musicians from around the world make pilgrimages to Seungmin's studio, hoping to experience their own supernatural collaborations and to tap into the same spiritual energy that transformed a young man's grief into a global movement. For cultural preservation, some come seeking connection with their own deceased relatives, others hope to access ancestral knowledge they never knew they possessed, and still others simply want to experience the profound peace and creative inspiration that the space is known to provide. Not everyone who visits has a dramatic supernatural experience like Seungmin's original encounter with his grandfather, but everyone who comes with sincere intentions and an open heart leaves with a deeper understanding of the connections that bind us all together, connections that transcend time, death, cultural differences, and the apparent boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. The story of Seungmin and his grandfather's posthumous collaboration has become more than just an incredible tale of supernatural phenomena. It has become a symbol of hope for anyone who has lost someone they love, a reminder that death is not the end of relationships but simply a transformation of the ways we connect with and influence each other. Leave a comment below, sharing your own experiences with feeling the presence of deceased loved ones, because these connections are more common and more real than most people realize. Like this video if you believe that love truly is stronger than death, and subscribe to hear more incredible true stories that will challenge your understanding of what's possible in this mysterious world we all share. Remember, the next time you're alone in a creative space during the quiet hours of the night, pay attention to the sounds your equipment picks up. Listen carefully to the spaces between the notes, the silence between the words, the background behind the foreground. You might discover that you're not as alone as you think you are. You might find that the people who loved you in life are still finding ways to love and guide you in death. And you might realize that music really is the universal language that connects all souls, living and dead, in an eternal symphony of love, memory, and creative expression that will continue long after we're all gone. The demo that Seungmin recorded alone at 3 a.m. turned out to be anything but a solo performance. It was the beginning of a collaboration that would last a lifetime, a partnership that would preserve centuries of cultural heritage, and a love story that proved once and for all that some bonds are too strong to be broken by something as simple as death. Because in the end, music never dies, love never dies, and neither do the connections that make us who we are.